The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Whitmore Palace as Princess Kathryn walked through the East Wing corridors. Her footsteps echoed softly against the ancient stones, a rhythmic sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. At 28 years old, Kathryn had spent most of her life within these walls, learning the delicate balance between duty and compassion that her position demanded. She paused outside the servants' quarters, noticing something unusual. A young maid named Emma sat huddled in a corner, her shoulders shaking with barely suppressed sobs. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing the standard blue uniform of the palace staff. Kathryn approached slowly, her silk gown rustling gently. She had always made it a point to know the names and faces of those who served in the palace. It was a practice her late mother had taught her, believing that true nobility came not from titles, but from how one treated others. "Emma," Kathryn said softly, kneeling beside the girl despite the expensive fabric of her dress. "What troubles you?" The maid looked up, her eyes widening in surprise and fear. Tears had left tracks down her pale cheeks, and there was something in her expression that made Kathryn's heart clench with concern. "Your Highness, I shouldn't... I'm fine. Truly," Emma stammered, attempting to rise and curtsy at the same time. Kathryn gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, keeping her seated. "Please, there's no need for formality right now. I can see you're distressed. Has someone hurt you?" Emma's lower lip trembled, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She glanced nervously down the hallway before whispering, "It's Lady Larissa, Your Highness. She's been so cruel." The name sent a chill through Kathryn. Lady Larissa Worthington had been appointed as the head of household staff just 6 months ago. She came with impressive credentials and recommendations from several noble houses. The woman was in her 40s, with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, known for her efficiency and strict adherence to protocol. "Tell me everything," Kathryn said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Emma hesitated, clearly torn between her fear of retribution and her desperate need for help. Finally, the words came tumbling out. "She strikes us, Your Highness. Not just scoldings or extra duties, but actual beatings. She has a cane she keeps in her office. Yesterday, she hit Mary so hard that the poor girl can barely walk today. And Thomas, the kitchen boy, has bruises all along his arms from where she grabbed him." Kathryn felt anger rise within her chest, hot and fierce. The palace was meant to be a place of safety and dignity for all who dwelt within its walls. The thought that someone was abusing their authority in such a heinous way made her blood boil. "How long has this been happening?" Kathryn asked, struggling to keep her voice calm. "Since she arrived, Your Highness, but it's gotten worse these past 2 months. She seems to take pleasure in it, especially with the younger staff members. We're all terrified of her." "Why hasn't anyone reported this before?" Emma's eyes filled with fresh tears. "She threatened us. Said she had connections with all the noble houses in the kingdom, that if we spoke out, she'd ensure we'd never find work again. Some of us have families to support, Your Highness. We couldn't risk it." Kathryn rose to her feet, her mind already working through what needed to be done. "Emma, I need you to be brave for just a little while longer. Can you gather the other staff members who have been hurt by Lady Larissa? Bring them to my private study in an hour. Use the servants' passages so Lady Larissa doesn't see you." "Your Highness, what if she finds out?" "She won't," Kathryn said firmly. "I give you my word as a princess of this realm that you are under my protection now. All of you are. No harm will come to you for speaking the truth." Emma nodded, a glimmer of hope appearing in her eyes for the first time. She curtsied and hurried away, using the hidden passages that servants had used for centuries to move unseen through the palace. Kathryn made her way to her study, her mind racing. She needed to handle this carefully. Accusations against a member of the nobility, even one in a servant position, required evidence. She couldn't simply dismiss Lady Larissa on the word of servants alone, not without risking a scandal that could undermine her authority. Her study was a comfortable room lined with books and filled with the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. She pulled out a fresh journal and began making notes, preparing to document everything she was about to hear. Within the hour, Emma returned with 6 other servants. There was Mary, limping noticeably, her face pale with pain. Thomas, barely 14, stood with his arms crossed protectively over his chest. Sarah, one of the chambermaids, had a fading bruise along her jawline that makeup couldn't quite hide. James, a footman, walked stiffly, favoring his left side. Alice, another young maid, kept her eyes downcast, her hands trembling. And finally, Robert, an older servant who had worked in the palace for 20 years, his weathered face grim with determination. "Please, sit," Kathryn said, gesturing to the chairs she had arranged in a circle. "I know this is difficult, but I need to hear your stories. Everything you tell me will be written down and used to ensure justice is served." One by one, they spoke. Their stories painted a picture of systematic abuse that made Kathryn's stomach turn. Lady Larissa had created a reign of terror in the servants' quarters, using physical punishment for the slightest infractions. A dish placed incorrectly would earn a strike with her cane. Speaking out of turn resulted in a slap across the face. Being late, even by a minute, meant bruising grips on arms or shoulders. Mary's voice shook as she described how Lady Larissa had struck her repeatedly with the cane for accidentally breaking a teacup. "She said I was clumsy and worthless, Your Highness, that I should be grateful she didn't dismiss me on the spot. The beating lasted so long that I fainted. When I woke up, she made me clean up my own blood from the floor." Thomas couldn't hold back his tears as he showed Kathryn the bruises on his arms. "She likes to grab and twist, Your Highness. Says it doesn't leave marks that show when we're serving. But it hurts so much. Sometimes I can't sleep because of the pain." Sarah revealed that Lady Larissa had struck her across the face for laughing in the hallway. "She said servants should be neither seen nor heard, and that my laughter was offensive to her ears. The bruise lasted for 2 weeks. I told my family I had fallen." As Kathryn documented each account, her anger grew. But she maintained her composure, knowing that these brave individuals needed her to be strong and focused. She asked detailed questions, noting dates, times, and any potential witnesses to the abuse. Robert, the senior servant, spoke last. "Your Highness, I've served this palace under your father and mother. May they rest in peace. Never in all my years have I seen such cruelty. We've tried to protect the younger ones, but Lady Larissa is cunning. She ensures her worst abuses happen when no one of standing is around to witness them." "Have any of you kept physical evidence?" Kathryn asked. "Torn clothing, medical records, anything that could support your testimonies?" Alice timidly raised her hand. I kept the dress she tore when she grabbed me. And I've been keeping a diary, writing down everything that happens. I hid it in the loose floorboard under my bed." "Excellent," Kathryn said, making a note. "Alice, I'll need you to retrieve that diary. It could be crucial evidence." "Your Highness," Robert said carefully, "may I ask what you intend to do? Lady Larissa has powerful friends. She's mentioned connections to the Duke of Eastmoor and the Countess of Blackwood." Kathryn set down her pen and looked at each of them in turn. "I intend to see justice done. No one, regardless of their connections or status, has the right to abuse those in their care. The palace should be a place of safety and dignity for all who serve here." She stood, moving to her desk, where she pulled out her official seal. "I'm going to write a formal complaint to the Royal Guard. Captain Morrison is a man of integrity who answers directly to the Crown. Lady Larissa's connections won't protect her from a royal investigation. But, Your Highness, Emma said nervously, what if she finds out before the guards arrive? She'll know we've spoken to you. Kathryn had already considered this. You'll all be relocated to the West Wing immediately, under my personal protection. I'll assign my own guards to ensure your safety. Lady Larissa won't be able to reach you there. She began writing the formal complaint. Her handwriting steady despite her inner turmoil. She detailed each allegation, referencing the witnesses and evidence available. The legal language came easily to her, years of royal education serving her well in this moment. As she wrote, she said, I want you all to know how brave you've been in coming forward. It takes tremendous courage to speak truth to power, especially when you've been threatened and hurt. The Crown has failed you by allowing this to happen, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Your Highness, Mary said softly, you didn't know. How could you? Lady Larissa was careful to maintain a perfect facade whenever nobility was present. Nevertheless, it's my responsibility to ensure the welfare of everyone in this palace, Kathryn replied. That's a duty I take seriously, and one I've clearly need to monitor more closely. She finished the formal complaint, sealed it with wax and her royal seal, and rang for her personal guard. Captain Morrison himself appeared within minutes, his graying hair and lined face showing his years of dedicated service. Your Highness, he said with a bow. How may I serve? Captain, I need you to read this immediately, Kathryn said, handing him the sealed document. And then I need you to act upon it with all haste. Morrison's expression grew increasingly grim as he read through the complaint. When he finished, his jaw was clenched with barely controlled anger. This is disturbing, Your Highness. Lady Larissa Worthington stands accused of serious crimes. She does indeed, Kathryn confirmed. These 7 servants have bravely come forward with their testimonies. There is also physical evidence to be collected. I want Lady Larissa detained immediately for questioning. It will be done, Your Highness, Morrison said. I'll take a contingent of guards to arrest her at once. Where is she now? Last I heard, she was conducting the afternoon inspection of the kitchens, Robert supplied helpfully. She follows a very rigid schedule. Good, Morrison said. Your Highness, with your permission, I'd like to bring Investigator Hartwell into this. She specializes in cases involving abuse of authority. Permission granted, Kathryn said. I want this investigation to be thorough and above reproach. Lady Larissa will undoubtedly try to use her connections to interfere. Morrison bowed again. I'll ensure that doesn't happen, Your Highness. No one is above the law, especially not someone who has violated the trust placed in them so egregiously. As Morrison left to organize the arrest, Kathryn turned back to the servants. Now, let's get you all moved to safety. Emma, please show the others to the West Wing. I'll have my personal maids prepare rooms for you all. Your Highness, Thomas said, his young voice filled with wonder. I've never slept in the West Wing. Isn't that where the noble guests stay? Kathryn smiled gently at him. It is. And you'll stay there as my personal guests until this matter is resolved. You've shown more nobility in coming forward than many who were born to titles. As the servants filed out, escorted by 2 of Kathryn's personal guards, Robert lingered behind. Your Highness, if I may, your mother would be proud of what you've done today. She always said that true leadership meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Kathryn felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of her mother. Thank you, Robert. That means more to me than you know. Alone in her study, Kathryn moved to the window that overlooked the courtyard. She could see Captain Morrison and his guards moving purposefully toward the kitchen wing. The arrest would happen soon, and then the real work would begin. There would be an investigation, a trial, and hopefully justice. But beyond that, Kathryn realized this incident had revealed a deeper problem. How many other abuses might be happening in the palace that she didn't know about? How many people were suffering in silence, too afraid to speak up? She returned to her desk and began drafting a new palace policy. There would be regular, private meetings between herself and representatives from the servant staff. An anonymous reporting system would be established. And most importantly, all those in positions of authority over others would undergo scrutiny and accountability measures. A commotion in the courtyard drew her attention back to the window. She could see Lady Larissa being led out in restraints, her face a mask of indignation and rage. Even from this distance, Kathryn could see her shouting, likely making threats about her powerful friends and the consequences of this arrest. But Captain Morrison's guards were unmoved, professionally escorting her to the prison wagon that would take her to the royal detention facility. Justice, Kathryn reflected, was blind to titles and connections when properly administered. As the wagon rolled away, Kathryn felt a sense of satisfaction mixed with sadness. It should never have come to this. Lady Larissa had been trusted with authority and had abused it in the worst possible way. The woman would face trial for her crimes, and given the evidence and testimonies, would likely spend years in prison. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Emma peered in nervously. "Your Highness, I'm sorry to disturb you, but Alice has retrieved her diary. She wanted you to have it immediately." "Thank you, Emma. Please, come in." Emma entered, followed by Alice, who clutched a worn leather journal to her chest. "I wrote everything down, Your Highness," Alice said, offering the diary with shaking hands. "Every incident I witnessed or experienced. I thought maybe someday someone would care enough to read it." Kathryn accepted the diary with reverence. "Someone does care, Alice. I care. And I promise you, your words won't be ignored. This diary will ensure that Lady Larissa faces justice for every single act of cruelty she committed." As the two maids left, Kathryn sat down to read Alice's diary. The entries were heartbreaking, detailing months of abuse and fear. But they were also meticulously detailed, with dates, times, and descriptions that would prove invaluable in court. The sun was setting by the time Kathryn finished reading. She felt emotionally drained, but also resolute. Tomorrow, she would meet with the investigator and ensure that the case against Lady Larissa was airtight. She would also begin implementing her new policies to prevent such abuse from happening again. But tonight, she had one more task. She made her way to the West Wing, where the 7 servants were settling into their temporary quarters. The transformation in their demeanor was already evident. Without the constant fear of Lady Larissa, they seemed younger, lighter somehow. "I wanted to check on you all before retiring," Kathryn said as they gathered in the common room, "and to thank you again for your courage today." "Your Highness," Mary said, tears in her eyes, "we should be thanking you. You listened to us. You believed us. Do you know how rare that is for people like us?" "It shouldn't be rare," Kathryn said firmly. "And I intend to make sure it becomes commonplace in this palace. Your voices matter. Your safety matters. Never forget that." As she bid them good night and returned to her own chambers, Kathryn felt the weight of the day's events settling upon her shoulders. She had uncovered a terrible abuse of power and taken steps to address it. But she knew this was just the beginning. Real change would take time, effort, and constant vigilance. Still, as she prepared for bed, she felt a sense of hope. 7 brave individuals had trusted her with their truth, and she had not let them down. Lady Larissa would face justice for her crimes. And perhaps most importantly, a message had been sent throughout the palace. Abuse would not be tolerated, no matter who the perpetrator might be. The first part of this story was just beginning, but already the wheels of justice were turning. And Princess Kathryn would ensure they didn't stop until every wrong had been made right. The Royal Investigation Office was located in the administrative wing of the palace, a place where justice and bureaucracy intersected. Princess Kathryn arrived early the next morning, accompanied by Captain Morrison and carrying Alice's diary along with her own detailed notes. The hallways were quiet at this hour, with only the occasional guard patrol breaking the silence. Investigator Helena Hartwell was already waiting in the conference room. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a severe bun, she had a reputation for being thorough, fair, and utterly incorruptible. Her sharp gray eyes missed nothing, and her presence commanded respect even from those who outranked her socially. "Your Highness," Hartwell said, rising and offering a formal curtsy. "I've reviewed the initial complaint. These are serious allegations indeed." "They are," Kathryn confirmed, taking her seat at the polished oak table. "And I believe they represent only a fraction of Lady Larissa's crimes. The servants were too frightened to come forward sooner." Hartwell opened her leather portfolio, revealing neat pages of notes. "I've already begun preliminary inquiries. Lady Larissa was arrested yesterday evening as you requested. She's being held in the Royal Detention Center, though she's been quite vocal about her innocence and her connections." "Has she requested legal counsel?" Morrison asked. "She has. Lord Pemberton will be representing her. He's known for taking on high-profile nobility cases." Hartwell's expression remained neutral, though Kathryn detected a slight tightening around her eyes. Pemberton was notorious for using every legal maneuver available to protect his wealthy clients. "Then we must ensure our case is beyond reproach," Kathryn said, placing Alice's diary on the table. "This contains detailed accounts of abuse spanning several months. The servant who wrote it, Alice Greenwood, documented everything meticulously." Hartwell carefully took the diary, handling it like the precious evidence it was. "This is excellent, Your Highness. Contemporary documentation is always powerful in court. Now I'll need to interview each of the victims individually. I understand they're currently under your protection in the West Wing." "They are. I felt it necessary to ensure their safety, especially once Lady Larissa's arrest became known among the staff." "A wise precaution," Hartwell agreed. "I'd like to begin the interviews this morning, if possible. I'll also need to examine any physical evidence. Torn clothing, medical records, and of course, I'll need to document any visible injuries." "Dr. Ashford has agreed to conduct medical examinations," Morrison added. "He's trustworthy and experienced in documenting injuries for legal proceedings." Hartwell made notes as they spoke. "Good. Now, Your Highness, I must ask, are you prepared for the scrutiny this case will bring? Lady Larissa's connections will likely attempt to discredit not just the servants' testimonies, but also question your involvement." Kathryn's chin lifted slightly, a gesture of determination she'd inherited from her mother. "I'm prepared for whatever comes. These people trusted me with their truth. I won't abandon them now because it might be politically inconvenient." "I expected nothing less," Hartwell said with what might have been approval. "Now let's discuss the legal framework. Lady Larissa is charged with assault, abuse of authority, and creating a hostile work environment. Under palace law, these charges carry significant penalties, including imprisonment and permanent banishment from any position of authority." The morning progressed with careful planning. Hartwell outlined her investigation strategy, while Kathryn provided additional context about palace protocols and the extent of Lady Larissa's authority. Morrison contributed his knowledge of similar cases and the procedures for maintaining evidence integrity. By midday, Hartwell was ready to begin her interviews. Kathryn accompanied her to the West Wing, wanting to reassure the servants that they were still under her protection. The sitting room had been transformed into a temporary interview space with comfortable chairs and soft lighting to help put the witnesses at ease. Emma was first, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she recounted her experiences. Hartwell's interviewing style was gentle but thorough, asking for specific details while maintaining a compassionate demeanor. She had Emma describe each incident of abuse, noting dates, times, locations, and any potential witnesses. "Tell me about the first time Lady Larissa struck you," Hartwell said, her pen poised over her notepad. Emma's voice was quiet but steady. It was my third day working under her. I had accidentally used the wrong polish on the silverware. She called me into her office and closed the door. Then she slapped me across the face and said I was an embarrassment to the palace. She said if I told anyone, she'd ensure my younger sister would never find work in any noble house. Your sister also works in service? Yes, at Lord Pembroke's estate. She's saving money to help our parents. They're getting older and can't work the farm like they used to. Hartwell made careful notes about the threat, understanding how Lady Larissa had used the servants' family situations against them. It showed a pattern of calculated cruelty that would be important in court. The interviews continued throughout the day. Mary could barely hold back tears as she showed Hartwell the still healing welts on her back from the cane. Dr. Ashford was called in to document the injuries, taking detailed notes and measurements that would serve as medical evidence. Thomas, despite his young age, provided remarkably clear testimony. His bruises were photographed, and he demonstrated how Lady Larissa would grab and twist his arms, leaving marks that were painful but easily hidden under his uniform sleeves. She said boys needed to be toughened up, Thomas explained, his voice small, that I was too soft for palace service. But I've been working here since I was 12 and no one else ever hurt me like she did. Sarah's testimony revealed another disturbing aspect of Lady Larissa's behavior. She seemed to take particular pleasure in hurting those she saw as pretty or proud. She once told me that servants shouldn't think too highly of themselves, that we needed to remember our place. The slap across my face was meant to humble me, she said. James, the footman, had tried to protect some of the younger servants and had paid the price. I stepped between her and little Annie from the laundry. Lady Larissa was raising her hand to strike the girl for dropping a basket of linens. I said it was my fault, that I'd bumped into Annie. Lady Larissa had me stay after dismissal and beat me with her cane until I could barely stand. And Annie? Hartwell asked. Did she witness this? No, I made sure she left first. But Robert saw me afterward. He helped me to my quarters and tended to my injuries. Each interview added another piece to the mosaic of abuse. Alice's diary proved invaluable, as her entries corroborated many of the incidents described by others. She had also noted patterns in Lady Larissa's behavior, how the abuse escalated around stressful palace events, how she targeted those without strong family connections, and how she maintained a perfect facade whenever nobility was present. Robert's testimony was particularly powerful. As a senior servant with decades of experience, his words carried weight. I've served under 6 different heads of household, Your Highness, he told Kathryn and Hartwell. Some were strict, yes, but none were cruel. Lady Larissa brought a darkness to the servants' quarters. We went from being proud to serve to being terrified to make the slightest error. Did you ever try to report her behavior through official channels? Hartwell asked. Robert's weathered face showed regret. I wrote a letter to the palace administrator, Lord Blackwell, but it was never acknowledged. I later learned that Lady Larissa and Lord Blackwell's wife are cousins. I suspect my letter never made it past his secretary. This revelation caused Hartwell to make additional notes. We'll need to investigate that connection. If complaints were suppressed due to personal relationships, that's another serious breach of protocol. By evening, Hartwell had compiled a substantial case file. The evidence was overwhelming. 7 detailed testimonies, medical documentation of injuries, Alice's diary with its meticulous records, and even some torn clothing that servants had kept as evidence of particularly violent encounters. Your Highness, Hartwell said as they concluded the day's work, I believe we have more than enough evidence to proceed with formal charges. However, I anticipate Lord Pemberton will argue that the servants conspired together to remove Lady Larissa from her position. How do we counter that? Kathryn asked. By showing the pattern of abuse and the consistency of the accounts. Alice's diary is particularly valuable here, as it was written contemporaneously with the events. It would be nearly impossible to fake such detailed, consistent entries. Additionally, The medical evidence speaks for itself. These injuries couldn't have been self-inflicted or accidental. Captain Morrison, who had been overseeing security for the interviews, added, "I've also discovered something interesting, Your Highness. 3 servants from Lady Larissa's previous position at Thornwood Manor have come forward. They heard about her arrest and want to add their testimonies to the case." Kathryn felt both vindication and horror. "She's done this before?" "It appears so. I've arranged for them to travel here tomorrow to meet with Investigator Hartwell." That evening, Kathryn couldn't shake the weight of what she'd learned. She called for her senior advisors, including Lord Chancellor Williams, a man who had served her father with distinction and now guided her in matters of law and governance. "Your Highness," Williams said after she'd briefed him on the situation, "you've handled this admirably. However, we must prepare for the political ramifications. Lady Larissa's arrest has already caused ripples among the nobility. Some are saying you've overstepped by taking the word of servants over a lady of standing." "Then they're part of the problem," Kathryn replied firmly. "No one standing gives them the right to abuse others." "I agree completely," Williams assured her, "but we must be strategic. I suggest we make this case a cornerstone of new palace reforms. Show that your actions aren't just about one bad apple, but about creating a better, more just system for all." Kathryn nodded thoughtfully. "I've already begun drafting new policies, regular welfare checks for all staff, an anonymous reporting system, and mandatory training for anyone in a supervisory position about appropriate conduct and the consequences of abuse." "Excellent. That shows forward thinking and turns a crisis into an opportunity for positive change." The next morning brought new developments. The 3 servants from Thornwood Manor arrived, their testimonies adding another layer to Lady Larissa's pattern of abuse. They described similar tactics: physical violence hidden beneath uniforms, threats against family members, and a careful maintenance of a respectable facade around nobility. One of them, an older woman named Margaret, had kept a telling piece of evidence. "She wrote me this letter when I finally found the courage to resign," Margaret said, producing a paper in Lady Larissa's distinctive handwriting. "She threatened to ruin my reputation if I ever spoke about what happened at Thornwood." Hartwell examined the letter carefully. "This is significant. It shows consciousness of guilt and a pattern of intimidation. Your Highness, with this additional evidence, I'm confident we can show that Lady Larissa is a serial abuser who has used her position and connections to avoid consequences for years." As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. Lady Larissa had been keeping detailed records of her own, not of household management as would be expected, but personal information about each servant that could be used against them. Family debts, sick relatives, past mistakes, anything that could be leveraged for control. She was building a system of fear, Hartwell observed, reviewing the documents seized from Lady Larissa's office. This wasn't just about anger or poor management. This was calculated psychological warfare. Meanwhile, Lord Pemberton had begun his defense strategy. He filed motions questioning the validity of servant testimony, arguing that their lower social status made them unreliable witnesses. He also attempted to have Alice's diary dismissed as evidence, claiming it could have been written after the fact. Kathryn watched these legal maneuverings with growing anger. "He's trying to use their very vulnerability against them," she said to Hartwell, "arguing that because they're servants, they can't be trusted to tell the truth about abuse." "Unfortunately, it's a common defense tactic," Hartwell replied. "But we have strong counter-arguments. The medical evidence is irrefutable, and the pattern of abuse across 2 different noble houses shows this isn't a conspiracy, but a consistent behavior pattern from Lady Larissa." The palace staff, meanwhile, had been watching the proceedings with intense interest. Word had spread quickly about Princess Kathryn's intervention and the protection she'd offered to those who came forward. Gradually, more stories began to emerge, not just about Lady Larissa, but about other instances of mistreatment that had been endured in silence. Kathryn found herself holding informal gatherings with various servant groups, listening to their experiences and concerns. It became clear that while Lady Larissa was an extreme case, the system itself had allowed for various levels of exploitation and disrespect. "We've created a culture where those in service are seen as less than human," Kathryn confided to Captain Morrison one evening. "Lady Larissa is just the most visible symptom of a deeper disease." "Change takes time, Your Highness," Morrison replied. "But what you're doing now, showing that their voices matter, that justice applies to everyone, that's how transformation begins." The investigation reached a crucial point when Hartwell uncovered financial irregularities in Lady Larissa's management of the household budget. Money allocated for servant welfare, medical supplies, proper clothing, adequate food had been diverted to her personal accounts. "She wasn't just abusing them physically," Hartwell reported. "She was stealing from the funds meant to ensure their well-being. We can add embezzlement to the charges." This financial crime proved to be a turning point. While some nobles might dismiss servant testimony, theft from the royal treasury was a crime they couldn't ignore. The evidence was clear in the ledgers: systematic diversion of funds over months, covered up with falsified receipts and forged signatures. Lord Pemberton's defense strategy began to crumble. Faced with mounting evidence from multiple sources, documented injuries, and now financial crimes, he shifted tactics. He attempted to argue that Lady Larissa suffered from a mental condition that affected her judgment, seeking a medical rather than criminal resolution. Kathryn was having none of it. "Mental distress doesn't excuse systematic abuse and theft," she told the royal prosecutor. "If she was truly unable to control her behavior, she should have sought help, not positions of authority over vulnerable people." The investigation also revealed the network that had protected Lady Larissa for so long. Her cousin Lord Blackwell had indeed suppressed complaints at the palace. At Thornwood Manor, she'd been quietly dismissed rather than prosecuted, with a glowing recommendation to avoid scandal. The pattern of protection for abusers among the nobility was laid bare. "We need to address this systemically," Kathryn told her council. "It's not enough to prosecute Lady Larissa. We need to ensure that no one else can use their connections to escape justice for abusing those in their care." She proposed new legislation that would make it a crime to suppress reports of abuse, regardless of the social status of those involved. It would also establish independent oversight of working conditions in all noble houses, not just the palace. The pushback from some nobles was immediate and fierce. They argued that Kathryn was overreaching, interfering in the traditional relationship between nobility and their servants. Some even suggested that she was being manipulated by disgruntled servants with ulterior motives. But Kathryn had an unexpected ally in the Duke of Westford, one of the most respected nobles in the kingdom. He publicly supported her reforms, revealing that his own daughter had discovered similar abuses in their household and had taken action to address them. "Princess Kathryn isn't weakening the nobility," the Duke declared at a council meeting. "She's strengthening it by holding us to the standards of honor we claim to embody. How can we expect loyalty and good service from those we mistreat?" As the investigation neared its conclusion, Hartwell compiled her final report. It was a damning document, over 200 pages detailing systematic abuse, financial crimes, and a culture of fear created by Lady Larissa Worthington. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. "Your Highness," Hartwell said as she presented the report, "this is one of the most comprehensive cases of abuse of authority I've ever investigated. Lady Larissa didn't just fail in her duties, she perverted them, turning a position meant to ensure smooth household operation into a tool for personal cruelty and gain." The report also included recommendations for systemic change. Beyond Kathryn's proposed reforms, Hartwell suggested regular training for all household supervisors, clear channels for reporting abuse that bypassed direct superiors, and regular audits of household accounts to prevent embezzlement. Lady Larissa, still in custody, had grown increasingly desperate. Through Lord Pemberton, she offered to resign her position and leave the kingdom if charges were dropped. When that was refused, she attempted to implicate others, claiming she was following established practices she'd learned from other noble houses. This last-ditch effort backfired spectacularly. Her accusations prompted investigations into other households, revealing that while some strict practices existed elsewhere, nothing approached the level of systematic cruelty she had inflicted. Her attempts to normalize her behavior only highlighted how extreme it had been. The servants who had testified were holding up remarkably well, supported by Princess Kathryn's protection and the growing sense that real change was possible. Emma had begun helping coordinate support for other servants who wanted to report mistreatment. Mary was recovering from her injuries under proper medical care. Thomas had started smiling again, the fear gradually leaving his young eyes. "You've given us hope, Your Highness," Robert told Kathryn during one of her visits to check on them. "Not just those of us who suffered under Lady Larissa, but all servants in the kingdom. You've shown that our lives and dignity matter." Alice had been particularly transformed by the experience. Once timid and fearful, she had found strength in knowing her careful documentation had helped bring justice. "I used to write in my diary thinking no one would ever care," she said. "Now I know that speaking truth, even in whispers, can eventually be heard." As the formal charges were prepared for trial, Kathryn reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. What had begun with a crying maid in a corridor had exposed systemic problems that went far beyond one cruel woman. But it had also shown the power of courage, both from those who spoke up despite their fear, and from those in authority willing to listen and act. The trial was set for the following month, and Kathryn knew it would be a defining moment for her reign and for the kingdom's values. Lady Larissa would face justice, but more importantly, a precedent would be set that abuse of power would not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's social standing. The second part of this story had revealed the depth of the corruption and the strength of those fighting against it. The stage was set for a trial that would determine not just Lady Larissa's fate, but the future of how the kingdom treated its most vulnerable citizens. The Royal Court of Justice stood as an imposing monument to law and order in the heart of the capital. On the morning of Lady Larissa Worthington's trial, crowds gathered outside despite the early hour and cold weather. News of the case had spread throughout the kingdom, sparking debates in taverns and drawing rooms alike about power, justice, and the treatment of those in service. Princess Kathryn arrived in the royal carriage, accompanied by Captain Morrison and her personal guard. She had chosen to wear her formal court attire, a deep purple gown embroidered with golden threads, the colors of justice and royalty combined. As she stepped from the carriage, she could hear the murmur of the crowd, some calling out words of support, others maintaining a watchful silence. Inside the courthouse, the grand chamber had been prepared for what many were calling the trial of the decade. The judge's bench dominated the room, with Chief Justice Thornborough presiding alongside two associate justices. The gallery was packed with nobles, merchants, and carefully selected members of the public. A special section had been reserved for palace servants who wished to witness the proceedings. Lady Larissa sat at the defendant's table, her appearance drastically changed from her days of authority. The months in custody had stripped away her imperious bearing, though she still attempted to project an air of wounded dignity. Lord Pemberton sat beside her, his expression carefully neutral as he arranged his papers. The prosecution was led by Royal Prosecutor Sir Edmund Blackstone, a man known for his brilliant legal mind and unwavering commitment to justice. Beside him sat Investigator Hartwell, her case files arranged with military precision. "All rise for the honorable justices," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom stood as one. Chief Justice Thornborough, A man in his 70s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes took his seat and surveyed the courtroom. "Be seated. We are here today in the matter of the Crown versus Lady Larissa Worthington. The defendant stands accused of multiple counts of assault, abuse of authority, creating a hostile work environment, embezzlement, and intimidation of witnesses. How does the defendant plead?" Lord Pemberton stood. "My client pleads not guilty to all charges, Your Honor." "Very well. Sir Edmund, you may present your opening statement." The prosecutor rose, his black robes sweeping as he moved to address the court. "Your Honors, the Crown will show that Lady Larissa Worthington systematically abused her position as head of household staff at Whitmore Palace. Over the course of 6 months, she created a reign of terror among those under her supervision, using physical violence, psychological manipulation, and threats to maintain control." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The evidence will show that this was not a case of strict management or occasional loss of temper. This was calculated cruelty, designed to break the spirits of those who had no recourse, no voice, no protection, until Princess Kathryn's intervention brought their suffering to light." Sir Edmund outlined the evidence they would present: testimonies from 7 palace servants, medical documentation of injuries, Alice's detailed diary, the threatening letter to Margaret from Thornwood Manor, and the financial records showing embezzlement. The defense may argue that servants are unreliable witnesses, that their testimony is motivated by revenge or gain. But the physical evidence doesn't lie. The bruises documented by Dr. Ashford don't lie. The financial records showing theft don't lie. And the pattern of abuse spanning 2 noble houses doesn't lie. Lord Pemberton's opening statement took a different approach. "Your Honors, my client has served the nobility faithfully for over 20 years. She has maintained order and efficiency in some of the kingdom's greatest houses. What we have here is a coordinated attack on a woman whose only crime was maintaining high standards." He argued that the servants had conspired to remove Lady Larissa because they resented her discipline. The financial irregularities were bookkeeping errors, not theft. The injuries were either exaggerated or the result of normal workplace accidents. "Ask yourselves," Pemberton said to the justices, "why these allegations only surfaced after my client had been in her position for 6 months. Why did no one speak up sooner if the abuse was so severe? The answer is simple: because it took time for them to coordinate their stories." The first witness called was Emma. She took the stand nervously, her hands trembling as she swore the oath. Sir Edmund approached her with a gentle demeanor, understanding the courage it took for her to testify. "Miss Whitfield, can you tell the court about your first encounter with Lady Larissa's temper?" Emma's voice was soft but clear as she recounted the slap she'd received for using the wrong polish. She described the fear that had gripped the servants' quarters, the way they would scatter like frightened mice when Lady Larissa approached. "She told us we were worthless," Emma said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "That we should be grateful she didn't throw us into the streets. She said our families would starve if we lost our positions, and she could make that happen with a single word." Lord Pemberton's cross-examination was harsh. He questioned Emma's memory, suggested she might have misunderstood Lady Larissa's actions, implied that she harbored resentment for being corrected. But Emma held firm, her quiet dignity more powerful than any shouting match. "I know what happened to me, sir," she said simply. "I know the difference between discipline and cruelty. Lady Larissa crossed that line every single day." Mary's testimony was even more harrowing. She struggled to walk to the witness stand, her injuries still affecting her movement. When asked to show the court her wounds, several people in the gallery gasped at the sight of the healing welts across her back. "She beat me until I fainted," Mary said, her voice breaking. "And when I woke up on her office floor, she made me clean up my own blood. She said it would teach me to be more careful with the palace property." Dr. Ashford was called to provide medical testimony. His professional demeanor and detailed documentation made it impossible to dismiss the injuries as accidents or exaggerations. He showed photographs, measurements, and medical charts that painted a picture of systematic abuse. "In my 30 years of practice," Dr. Ashford stated, "I have rarely seen such deliberate and repeated infliction of injury outside of actual warfare. These wounds were caused by someone who knew how to maximize pain while minimizing visible damage." Thomas's testimony brought several people in the gallery to tears. The young boy described the terror of being grabbed and twisted, the bruises that made it painful to carry out his duties, the nightmares that still plagued him. "She said she was making me stronger," Thomas said, his young voice confused. "But I don't understand how hurting someone makes them strong. My father never hurt me to teach me lessons." When Lord Pemberton tried to suggest that boys often exaggerated minor incidents, Chief Justice Thornborough intervened. "Lord Pemberton, the witness is a child testifying about abuse. You will maintain appropriate decorum in your questioning." The introduction of Alice's diary marked a turning point in the trial. Sir Edmund had Alice read selected entries, her voice growing stronger as she shared the words she'd written in secret, fearing they would never see the light of day. March 15th. "Lady L struck Emma again today for laughing in the hallway. The sound of the slap echoed off the walls. We all pretended not to hear, but I saw James clenching his fists." "How long before one of us breaks?" "April 2nd. Thomas can barely move his arms. Lady L grabbed him so hard yesterday that I could see the finger marks turning purple. He's just a boy. When did cruelty become acceptable discipline?" "April 20th. Mary hasn't come out of her room since the beating. I helped her change the bandages on her back. The wounds are deep. I'm documenting everything, hoping someday someone will care enough to stop this." Lord Pemberton attempted to discredit the diary, suggesting it could have been written recently. But Sir Edmund produced testimony from the palace stationer who confirmed selling Alice that specific diary over a year ago, and a handwriting expert who verified the natural progression of entries over time. The testimony from the Thornwood Manor servants added another dimension to the case. Margaret's account of her experiences and the threatening letter she'd received showed this wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior. "She was careful at Thornwood," Margaret testified. "Only hurt those of us without connections, without family in service to other nobles. When I finally found the courage to resign, she wrote me that letter saying she'd ensure I never worked again if I spoke of what happened." The letter itself was damning. In Lady Larissa's own hand, it contained explicit threats and an admission that she knew her behavior would be condemned if it became public. Robert's testimony carried particular weight. As a senior servant with decades of experience, his words painted a picture of how Lady Larissa had corrupted the entire servant hierarchy. "I've served under strict supervisors before," Robert said. "But there's a difference between maintaining standards and breaking spirits. Lady Larissa didn't want good service. She wanted fear. She wanted to see us cower when she entered a room." He also testified about his attempted complaint to Lord Blackwell and how it had been ignored. This led to Lord Blackwell himself being called as a witness, where he uncomfortably admitted to dismissing the complaint without investigation due to his family connection to Lady Larissa. The financial evidence proved equally damaging. The royal auditor presented clear documentation showing how Lady Larissa had diverted funds meant for servant welfare into her personal accounts. Receipts had been forged. Suppliers had been overpaid with kickbacks going to Lady Larissa, and money allocated for medical supplies had simply vanished. "This wasn't mismanagement," the auditor stated. "This was systematic theft. Over 6 months, Lady Larissa stole nearly 3,000 gold crowns meant for the welfare of palace staff." When it came time for Lady Larissa to testify in her own defense, the courtroom fell silent. She took the stand with an attempt at her old imperious bearing, but the cracks showed. Her voice, once so commanding, now carried a defensive whine. "I was maintaining order," she insisted. "These servants were lazy, incompetent, and needed firm guidance. If I was occasionally harsh, it was only to ensure the palace maintained its standards." Sir Edmund's cross-examination was devastating. He presented her with specific incidents, asking her to explain how beating Mary until she fainted maintained palace standards, how stealing money meant for medical supplies improved service, how terrorizing children made them better workers. Lady Larissa's composure crumbled. She alternated between denial, justification, and eventually angry accusations against everyone from the servants to Princess Kathryn herself. "They're lying!" she shouted at one point. "All of them! This is a conspiracy to destroy me because I wouldn't tolerate their laziness." "And the medical evidence?" Sir Edmund asked calmly. "The documented injuries? Are those lies too?" "They hurt themselves to frame me, or each other. These people have no honor, no loyalty." Her outburst did more damage to her case than any testimony. The justices exchanged glances as she ranted about the inferiority of servants, their inability to appreciate proper discipline, and how the nobility was being undermined by giving credence to their complaints. Princess Kathryn was called as the final witness. She took the stand with quiet dignity, aware that her testimony would carry enormous weight. She described finding Emma crying, the interviews with the servants, and her decision to take action. "As a member of the royal family," Kathryn said, "I have a duty to protect all who serve in the palace. When I learned of the systematic abuse occurring under my roof, I had no choice but to act. To do otherwise would be to betray everything the crown stands for." Lord Pemberton tried to suggest that Kathryn had been manipulated by sob stories, that her youth and inexperience had been exploited. But Kathryn's responses were measured and intelligent, showing she had carefully considered all evidence before acting. "Lord Pemberton," she said at one point, "I did not make this decision lightly. I investigated thoroughly, consulted with experienced advisors, and ensured due process was followed. The evidence speaks for itself. Lady Larissa abused her position, and she must face the consequences." The closing arguments summarized the cases each side had built. Sir Edmund spoke passionately about the abuse of power, the violation of trust, and the need for justice regardless of social station. He reminded the justices that their decision would send a message throughout the kingdom about how the vulnerable would be protected. Lord Pemberton made one last attempt to discredit the servant's testimony, to paint Lady Larissa as a victim of changing times and ungrateful subordinates, but his arguments rang hollow after the weight of evidence presented. Chief Justice Thornborough called for a recess while the justices deliberated. The waiting was agony for all involved. The servants huddled together in their section, some praying quietly, others simply holding hands for comfort. Lady Larissa sat rigidly at the defendant's table, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. After 3 hours, the justices returned. The courtroom rose as they entered, the air thick with anticipation. "Lady Larissa Worthington," Chief Justice Thornborough began, his voice carrying the full authority of the law, "this court has heard extensive testimony and reviewed substantial evidence regarding the charges against you. The testimonies of multiple witnesses, supported by medical documentation, financial records, and your own written words, paint a clear picture of systematic abuse and criminal behavior." He paused, his gaze fixed on Lady Larissa. "On the charges of assault, we find you guilty on all 7 counts. On the charge of abuse of authority, guilty. On creating a hostile work environment, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, guilty in the amount of 2,873 gold crowns. On the charge of witness intimidation, guilty." Each pronouncement of guilt seemed to strike Lady Larissa like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. "For these crimes," the Chief Justice continued, This court sentences you to 15 years in the royal prison with hard labor. You are stripped of your title and forbidden from ever holding a position of authority over others. The stolen funds will be recovered from your personal assets and returned to the Palace Welfare Fund. Furthermore, he added, this court recommends that Princess Kathryn's proposed reforms regarding servant welfare and protection be implemented immediately across all noble houses in the kingdom. Let this case serve as a clear message. Abuse of power will not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's social standing. The courtroom erupted. Some nobles sat in shocked silence, while others nodded in approval. The servants' section burst into tears of relief and joy. Emma clutched Mary's hand, both women crying freely. Thomas was held by Robert, the boy's thin shoulders shaking with released emotion. Lady Larissa had to be physically supported by guards as the verdict was read. Her shouts of innocence and threats of retribution were ignored as she was led away to begin her sentence. Lord Pemberton gathered his papers in defeat, knowing this case would likely damage his reputation for defending the indefensible. Princess Kathryn felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that justice had been served, sadness that it had been necessary, and determination to ensure such abuse never happened again in any household under her influence. After the trial, Kathryn met with the servants who had testified. They gathered in a private chamber, away from the crowds and publicity. The transformation in them was remarkable. Where once they had cowered in fear, they now stood tall with dignity restored. "Your Highness," Robert spoke for the group, "we cannot thank you enough. You gave us our voices back. You showed us that we matter." "You always mattered," Kathryn replied. "I'm only sorry it took so long for someone to listen. But things will be different now. The reforms are already being drafted into law. Regular inspections, anonymous reporting systems, and severe penalties for abuse are just the beginning." Emma stepped forward. "Your Highness, I've been thinking. Would it be possible to create a support system for servants who've suffered abuse? Somewhere they can go for help and healing?" Kathryn smiled. "That's an excellent idea, Emma. In fact, I'd like you to help coordinate it. Your experience and compassion would be invaluable." The ripple effects of the trial spread quickly throughout the kingdom. Other noble houses began reviewing their own practices, some out of genuine concern for justice, others from fear of similar prosecution. Reports of abuse that had been suppressed for years began surfacing, leading to additional investigations and reforms. The Duke of Westford became a powerful ally in implementing the new protections. He established the first Servant Welfare Council in his own holdings, giving workers a formal voice in addressing grievances. Other progressive nobles followed suit. Not everyone was pleased with the changes. Some nobles grumbled about the erosion of traditional authority, the danger of servants becoming uppity, and the inconvenience of new oversight. But public opinion had shifted decisively. The image of young Thomas on the witness stand, describing his abuse with confused innocence, had touched hearts across social classes. Lady Larissa's former connections distanced themselves rapidly. Lord Blackwell resigned from his position as palace administrator, his failure to investigate complaints making his position untenable. The Countess of Blackwood, who had provided one of Lady Larissa's original recommendations, publicly apologized for not being more thorough in her assessment. 6 months after the trial, Kathryn hosted a special ceremony at the palace. The 7 servants who had testified were honored for their courage with specially commissioned medals of valor. It was unprecedented for servants to receive such recognition, but Kathryn insisted their bravery deserved acknowledgement. "These individuals," Kathryn said in her speech, "faced down their fears and spoke truth to power. They risked everything to protect others from suffering. That is the very definition of heroism." Mary, now fully recovered from her injuries, had been promoted to a supervisory position, one she filled with kindness and understanding. Thomas had begun attending palace school, his bright mind finally given the chance to flourish. Alice had become the official chronicler of servant welfare, her meticulous nature perfect for documenting the improvements being made. Emma had thrown herself into creating the support network for abused servants. Within a year, safe houses had been established in major cities where those fleeing abusive situations could find shelter and legal aid. The network saved countless lives and gave hope to those who had previously had none. James and Sarah had married, their shared experience creating a bond that grew into love. They continued working at the palace, now in an environment of respect and dignity. Robert, offered retirement with full honors, chose to stay on as an advisor for servant affairs, his wisdom and experience invaluable in shaping new policies. The changes weren't limited to the palace. The Servant Protection Act, passed unanimously by the Royal Council, established minimum standards for treatment, regular inspections, and severe penalties for abuse. Education programs were created to teach both nobles and servants about rights and responsibilities. A new generation grew up understanding that authority came with accountability. Princess Kathryn often reflected on how a single moment of compassion, stopping to comfort a crying maid, had led to such sweeping change. She kept Alice's diary in her private library, a reminder of the power of documented truth and the courage of those who dare to record injustice. Lady Larissa served her full sentence, her requests for early release denied. Prison reports indicated she never showed remorse, maintaining to the end that she was a victim of ungrateful servants and a misguided princess. But her name became synonymous with abuse of power, a cautionary tale told in noble houses across the kingdom. Years later, when historians wrote about Princess Kathryn's reign, they would mark the trial of Lady Larissa Worthington as a turning point. It was the moment when the kingdom chose justice over tradition, compassion over cruelty, and recognized that true nobility was measured not by birth or title, but by how one treated those who had the least power. The palace itself was transformed. Where once servants had scurried through hallways in fear, they now moved with confidence and pride. The quality of service actually improved when people were treated with respect rather than fear. Laughter could be heard in the servants' quarters, and the palace became known as one of the best places to work in the kingdom. On the 5th anniversary of the trial, a monument was erected in the palace gardens. It wasn't a grand statue or elaborate structure, but a simple stone bench with an inscription, "In honor of those who spoke truth despite their fear, and in memory of those whose voices were never heard. Let justice flow like a river, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Emma, now the director of servant welfare, often sat on that bench during her breaks. She would think about how far they had come and how much further they still had to go. Change was slow, and there were still pockets of resistance. Still those who believed that some people were born to serve and suffer in silence. But every time she received a report of abuse being stopped, of a servant finding safety and justice, of a noble house implementing fair practices, she knew the fight had been worth it. Princess Kathryn had given them more than justice. She had given them hope and dignity. The story of Princess Kathryn and the 7 brave servants who stood up to Lady Larissa became legend, told and retold throughout the kingdom. Parents used it to teach their children about courage and justice. Servants drew strength from it when facing their own challenges. And nobles were reminded that their power came with sacred responsibilities. In the end, Lady Larissa's cruelty had inadvertently created the very change she would have despised. Her abuse had sparked a revolution of compassion. Her tyranny had given birth to freedom, and her attempts to break spirits had instead forged them into something unbreakable. The palace records showed that after the reforms, productivity increased, loyalty deepened, and the kingdom prospered. It turned out that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, it was practically effective. When people felt valued, They gave their best. When they felt safe, they thrived. Princess Kathryn continued to meet regularly with servant representatives throughout her reign. She never forgot that moment in the corridor with Emma. Never forgot that leadership meant listening to the quietest voices and protecting the most vulnerable. Her reign was marked by justice, prosperity, and an unwavering commitment to the principle that every person, regardless of their station, deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. And in the servant quarters of palaces across the kingdom, in the small rooms where those who served laid their heads to rest, they slept peacefully, knowing that they were seen, they were valued, and they were protected. The age of suffering in silence had ended. The age of justice had begun.